welcome to the Theology Pugcast. Good to have you for this episode. We've got a special guest with us today, but let's go ahead and introduce ourselves in case this is your first time tuning in. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor, and I serve a church right outside Portland, Oregon. I just finished writing a book on artificial intelligence, but it probably won't be out for like 6 months. But anyway, I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine, too. Okay, Glenn, how about you?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a professor emeritus of European history at Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I have my own ministry as well, Every Square Inch Ministries at eSquareInch.org, and on Substack at just simply Glenn Sunshine.
Okay. Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology and ethics, both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I do some ministerial work and write and speak, and most importantly, I'm a dad, like all of you.
Well, except for a guest.
She's a mom. Sorry.
Right. Annie, why don't you introduce yourself? It's great to have you back on the show. I wasn't here last time you were with us, but anyway, I'm familiar with your work, of course, but folks out there in Pugcast land might not be, so please let us know about it.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be with you, gentlemen. I'm excited to have the chance to talk with all of you. I am Annie Crawford, classical educator, which means I teach great books for high schoolers, and also a cultural apologist, which means I work, I write, I speak at the intersection of faith and culture, talking about how our cultural structures, the stories we tell, the rituals we live by, the technology we use, the language we speak, all those cultural things shape our imagination, which is really the source of what we experience as meaningful, plausible, desirable. And so it's, what we're going to find compelling rationally largely depends upon this kind of imaginative work that precedes, let's say, rational thinking. So I write and talk a lot about that. And the unifying point of those two areas of work is C.S. Lewis. So I do a lot of work around C.S. Lewis because he was both a master of the great books, of the great tradition, as well as the father of cultural apologetics with his Narnia, The Great Divorce, really trying to work to help people imagine what the Christian faith is like. So that's me, and I'm excited to be here chatting with you guys.
Great. Well, I really like the term when you refer to C.S. Lewis as the father of cultural apologetics. I think you're right, but I'd never heard that put that way before. Anyway, we've asked Glenn to kind of shepherd us along today on the show and kind of lead the interview a bit. So, Glenn, why don't you take it from here and help us to get to know a little bit about Annie and what she's up to and some other things.
Well, actually, the inspiration for asking Annie on this time, I'm always looking for a good excuse to bring her on, but the inspiration this time was a conference held a week or so ago in Illinois called the Midwestuary. And Annie attended, and all of the reports I've gotten from it indicate that it was just a great event, a fabulous conference with a lot of really important things going on. So I thought we'd bring Annie on to talk about it since I'm not able to get in touch with, I'm not able to wrestle any of the actual speakers onto the show. And I'm sure Annie, as a participant, will have a lot of interesting things to say about overall what was going on. So Annie, why don't you start off by telling us what Midwestuary is? It's not your normal conference in a lot of ways.
No, it's not. And I think it's helpful to maybe place the Midwestuary within a sort of cultural, historical context, right? So I'm going to be the obnoxious person who says, we need to go back to William of Ockham, right? That pesky little gadfly who about 600 years ago decided it was a great idea to tear apart things and meaning and to begin this kind of modern rending of heaven and earth that has taken 600 years to unfold. Slowly this tearing apart of mind and body with Descartes, of spirit and matter, of fact and value, tearing apart subject object, and then more recently, tearing apart the relationship between men and women.
Yeah.
Very recently, between online life and physical life. And here we are standing in this moment, kind of amidst the ruins of the great cathedral that was Western Christendom, and staring around and trying to figure out how on earth do we put these pieces back together, especially at this moment where kind of the structures of society are so potent and so powerful. And so you'll hear maybe people talk about the meaning crisis. And I think that's a word you'll hear kind of in these circles. Once things and meaning and everything's sort of torn apart, then it's hard to feel the meaning of your life, the significance of your life, the way that your life relates to the other parts of your world. And so I think that's the context for the Jordan B. Peterson phenomenon, right? So in that ruined cathedral, here comes in Jordan Peterson. So there's this kind of irony that here we are at that kind of end of this world, experiencing all this fragmentation, isolated in suburbia in our apartments. And yet, ironically, this digital medium right here, which in some ways fragments us, there's a kind of silver lining or ironic reversal where here we are able to start connecting again, to have conversations with people who have shared purposes and shared understanding and shared stories. And so in that moment, you get Peterson and his YouTube phenomena and the algorithm, feeding us these biblical lectures that kind of start to turn the corner. He's a Jungian, he's spiritually open, but he's kind of in we're going to use the word estuary as we talk about Midwestuary. So we need to realize an estuary is the mixing place of fresh water and salt water, right? And so here we are torn apart. And if we're going to come back together, we're going to have to go through these intermixing, estuary, mingling spaces. And in many ways, Peterson provided that because he's a scientific psychologist. And so he speaks the language of, he'll draw from scientific study and data, but he's also kind of a spiritually open Jungian. And so he's going to return to, ancient wisdom and biblical stories and start to provide an intermixing of things and meaning again in a way that isn't quite so dogmatic or scary. And so you have the Jordan Peterson phenomenon and the YouTube algorithm feeding us all his videos, and then people finding each other in the comment section, right? And and this resonating with people, their desire for meaning, and him helping people find meaning by making their bed and living with some courage and some hope. And they're finding each other in the comments. And then you kind of begin to get this secondary video world of people making videos about Jordan Peterson videos and commenting on those. And so you kind of get this micro community emerging online around the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. Two key figures then enter into this scene. One is Jonathan Pujo and his symbolic world and his personal friendship with Peterson. And, a lot of people will notice that Peterson is touching on the edge of Christianity. But, then he'll come in along and be like, oh, well, what do you mean by real? Or, well, I'm not sure what you mean by God, right? So he'll kind of bring people up to the edge of full integration, but not quite ready to step across the bridge himself. Well, Pujo, his friend, is, so Pujo will say, I will go ahead and be open about the ontological, metaphysical implications of the things that Peterson is talking about. And so you get this Peterson-Pujo pipeline back into the church that I think has had a lot to do with, Justin Brierley, his work tracing the surprising return of belief in God. But all this is still largely online, right? Yeah. And so then the question is, what do we do with this? Because we are incarnate creatures, and just having these conversations, this beginning renewal of meaning only in an online space doesn't resonate with our nature. It's not fully satisfying, right? So enter the second figure here in the story. Thanks for bearing with my kind of long introduction here, is Paul Vanderklay. And Paul Vanderklay is this Dutch Reformed pastor, and you can, spend any time listening to Paul and you immediately just hear his pastoral heart. He'll talk about his dad. His dad was a great pastor, and just that gift of loving on people and loving to talk to people and spend time with people. But he's also, as a intelligent man who likes to think. He's kind of high in openness. He's good at telling it slant, at coming to these conversations from sort of from a slant angle. Forgive me for not thinking of a better synonym. And so in that way, when we're too direct and dogmatic, our conversations can be dead in the water. And so Paul Vanderklay combines both this lovely pastoral heart and a kind of open, surreptitious way of talking about these issues. And so he just started making all these videos about Pujo and about Peterson, but in a way that invited what he calls randos into the conversation. So anyone who's in the YouTube comments, he'll be like, log on, talk with me. And he just has this really gracious patience for humans and for the messy conversation that is pastoral work. And so he became this pastor of what ends up being called the little corner, this corner of videos about Peterson and Pujo, of social media conversations about them, and all kind of being pastored by Paul. And so, part of that process was then, okay, how do we bring this into our physical life? How do we take this online connection, bring it into our physical life? And so kind of drawing from some of the wisdom in, let's say, AA circles, Paul created his sort of Estuary protocol, which incorporates reflective listening structures so that people can get together and actually have fruitful conversations about the meaning crisis and their response to the meaning crisis and how they're trying to knit their world back together. And they started making them into live retreats. So you might have a retreat of 12 people, 20 people, or a bigger conference. All that leads to Midwestuary, which is the biggest conference they've had yet. Some of the key speakers being Pujo, John Vervaeke, Rod Dreher. But then the attendees are, beautiful young men who have found themselves largely isolated and alienated, coming together to practice building these relationships in person and meditating on how can we, move this meaning recovery forward. So that's the Midwestuary. Let me pause there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm familiar with Pujo, of course, and Peterson. I've heard the name of Vanderklay, but I'm not familiar with him.
He does comment on our YouTube videos every now and then.
Oh, does he? I didn't know that. Didn't know. Well, I'm chastised. Anyway, I'm intrigued by the fact that he, as Reformed, and is interacting with Pujo and this whole phenomenon, because someone like Pujo would likely draw a line between nominalism and the Reformed tradition, and so nominalism, of course, when we get back to John Duns Scotus and all that stuff. So I'm wondering about how he interacts. So I'm not sure. I don't what it's, obviously he's Dutch Reformed, but I'm just wondering what branch of the Dutch Reformed, because it's just like Presbyterianism. You get a whole bunch of different types.
Yeah. Before we get there, it's worth noting one thing about the Dutch. They were the guys who really sort of discovered and started incorporating worldview thinking into the church. They were the first people to really do that. And I think Vanderklay is probably, I don't know his work very well at all, but I suspect that one of the reasons why he was able to jump into that is he's used to thinking, well, worldviewishly, so that he can interact with people who have different worldviews and talk with them, because he understands the way different worldviews operate, and he can, this I think frees him up in a lot of ways to be more engaged with other sorts of people, particularly with his pastoral side.
But
that combination, I think, is really powerful.
But it's a very ironic, because worldview and participatory relationships tend to bump up against each other. So that's a very oddity in one way, because worldview tends to be come at it very much from the realm of idealism and versus the participatory and the sharing in. I think the one point in that is that the Dutch Reformed do have a strong emphasis on returning to created order. And I think that probably doctrine of creation, probably you're going to find, is the interweaving connection through all of this, though no one wants to mention it loudly. But it really is. And the sacramental nature of creation, because sacrament is really talking about the way in which word has embedded itself into the very fabric of the created order, which gives rise to the symbol and the meaning and all of that. So at the end of the day, to be Christian in their relationship of that, whatever strand, whether it's Dutch Reformed or Orthodox or anything else, that's the shared sort of Catholic setting, which everyone shares if they're going to be Christian, that there is the word, through him all things are made. Without him was not anything made that was made. What do you do with that? If you bracket that out, you're not Christian. If you start to consider what its implications are, you start to have a conversation like what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as I said, I see Paul personally as someone high in openness, someone who's very able to say, I can work with you and relate with you in the space where we have common ground.
Yeah.
No problem. And I think more and more it is what we're going to need, is to be able to find common cause with people where we can. That doesn't mean that we don't recognize the importance of our distinctions, but that we're able to kind of set those places aside as needed in order to be able to, work in just the space of, things mean things and God exists and, morality is real. We can work together in those spaces. But I think part of the knitting back together that is happening, we talked about this last time I was with y'all, my deep feeling that we are at the end of a world and we are turning a corner and we are moving into the new world, and it's messy and we're not quite sure what it's going to look like. But, things can't really fall apart that much more, at least not philosophically. And so turning that corner and starting to weave things together, I think one of the main places I hear that happening is this connection between worldview and participatory, right? Because we've come to realize that worldview is not a list of doctrines. It's really a story of, that our understanding of the world as creatures who live in time, and as Scripture reveals to us, is a story, the great story of Christ's redemption of the world, into which we are invited. That is a more coherent way of understanding a worldview, is narratively. And a narrative is something we participate in, right? That this big macrocosmic narrative is something, okay, so what? I need to begin to participate in that narrative within my own sphere, imitating the patterns. And so I think people are starting to understand that more and more, and it is closing the gap between the overly intellectual, abstract worldview and how then shall we live, as Schaeffer would say.
Yeah. Now, I've been lately, working with the Colson Center. I do a lot of stuff with worldview, but lately I've been arguing that your worldview isn't what you think it is necessarily. It's what you live. Exactly. So how you live is what reveals what your worldview really is. And I like the idea of putting that in the context of narrative, because we all see ourselves ultimately as part of some sort of story. And what is the meaning of my story is a critical question.
Often in our world today, we're told we're supposed to invent the story for ourselves. So it's a self-created story. Yeah. But, of course, that's very isolating unless you buy into a story that's sort of gone viral. So I think a lot of the weirdness that we've experienced over the last 20 years, particularly with the advent of online communities, has to do with that. I think this is where maybe the kind of the sense that there's a contagion with some particular ways of thinking about yourself and stuff like that are really destructive. I mean, literally, physically destructive. But this phenomenon that you've brought out, Annie, that people are finding each other online in their quest for meaning, or at least through, say, the initial kind of introduction to Jordan Peterson, who was daring enough to defy the sort of the rising sort of tide of wokeness, and just said, I'm just not going to go along with this. And a lot of people said, well, what's up with that guy? I mean, shouldn't he be the guy that's leading the charge on this because of his background in the academy? And so there was a lot of intrigue, interest in him for that reason. But then, kind of getting back to, I think, a thing that we're all kind of dealing with is often we find ourselves in communities made up of people who don't identify with their communities. When I mean like your town, your suburb, or wherever so we're already kind of atomized in a pretty significant way. Even families are just spread out all over the place. And so then, to reverse this, if we're going to have some kind of incarnational realization of community, which I think is absolutely necessary for it to be genuine community, we're going to have to rediscover where we live and make a series of commitments to those places, which may mean relating to people we don't necessarily like or want to be around all that much. Now, some of this has been kind of going on, but not with the second part of what I said. People are actually moving to places like Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where a lot of Catholics are moving, or like our area, Battleground, where a lot of Reformed people move. We actually have a lot of people coming here because they identify with our church and what we're up to, and I think we can think of other places like that. I'm just wondering whether we can really expect kind of a great sort to kind of get this, because that's one of the things people have talked about. People have moved from California, moving to Tennessee or whatever. You have any thoughts on any of that, Annie?
Yeah, I think it's a formidable problem to think about how to actually move these connections into our local spaces, but that ultimately, that is what we're made for and needs to happen. And it's going to be a slow process. I do think you're right that this sorting, I heard one or two people talking about, at Midwestuary, I want to talk about where to move.
Yeah, right.
How to build on these relationships in that more dramatic way. Another thing, I'm not able to move right now. I am where I am. So one thing I've tried to do is be very proactive about who's in Texas, who's in Austin. I met two people who are in Austin. I put them on my list of when I'm going to host an event or, a dinner, doing whatever I can to try and find any overlapping point and just give it some attention and energy as at least a baby step toward building, some of these connection points in personal space. But it's not going to be an easy problem to solve. It'll take time and intentional sacrifice to move toward that direction.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm intrigued by that moves in a different direction from that is the idea of the estuary, the place where fresh and salt water mix, the place where believers and unbelievers are going to mix. And there is that's kind of probably oversimplifying things to describe it as believers and unbelievers. But there is a point at which we also need to think about how do we engage with and have some form of community with people who aren't like us, who don't believe what we believe, who don't think what we think. And one of the things I really like about the estuary concept is it's a way of trying to bring different groups together. In sort of traditional terms, this could be a great evangelistic opportunity, but if you think about it that way, it's not going to work.
Well,
how do you draw them into community with you?
That requires a great deal of tolerance in the best sense of the word Glenn. So, Annie, you're in Austin. I lived in Cambridge. I mean, Tom and Glenn, you know what it's like to live in places like that.
Yeah.
A lot of folks can't handle it. And in fact, it takes a lot of, it can drain you even when you can, when you're just in an environment where there's just kind of just unceasing disagreement about fundamental things. I mean, like just basic fundamental things that take for example something as innocuous as a gender reveal party for a baby. You'd have people who are just offended at the very concept, not even taking into consideration blue and pink. That kind of stuff. A place like Austin, that's almost like a non-starter if you get outside a church environment.
Yeah, and I'm from Oregon.
Yeah, well then, that's where we are here. And the interesting thing about the town I'm, located in, Battleground, is we're like the anti-Portland. I mean, we're half an hour from the airport, but we are as un-Portland as they get, and almost self-consciously. It's almost like a kind of a militant anti-Portland spirit that makes Battleground what it is.
Right. So
and Annie's connected to the music capital of the world, so that's sorry.
So no problem. Well, yeah. So Chris, I think you make a really important point. It's difficult, and to have actual estuary spaces, to be able to have relationship with the people who need the gospel, and it does take a lot of tolerance in the good sense. And I think one reason why we struggle with that is this. The way that modernity and democratization just flattens everything, just all this kind of mush of everybody at the same level. It can't work that way. Like, we can't tolerate that much difference all the time everywhere. And so we have to start to think hierarchically again. We have to think, and you'll hear people talk about, well, Jesus did this. He had his 3 besties and then his disciple. We need circles we need structure to our relationships. And that's where, so that we feel that we needed to take our differences seriously in that way, right? So I can go to a conference, an estuary conference, and have conversation with, they do these breakout groups, which are great. So another thing they're trying to do is balance this hierarchy of the parasocial relationship to the famous speakers, and then, the randos on the ground. And so they structure it as a mix of talks, but then these estuary breakout groups, and they invite speakers to be part of those smaller groups. And they really try to structure a way to bridge relationship, to demythologize, while also honoring the work of the speakers, which is, I think, was really fruitful, and works really well. But going back to like, at that level, at the estuary, in our group, there was a guy who called himself like an art weirdo, and he wasn't sure about Christianity, and and that's fine because we could have an open conversation. But I'm not doing school with him, right? And so when I'm educating my kids, education is discipleship. Those are integrated. We have good boundaries around our co-op, that we need to have a shared purpose, shared worldview, shared mission, so that this wagon and the horses pulling it can move together in step the same way. Because if we tolerate too much difference at that level, it's not going to work. It's going to be exhausting. And so I think we got to think hierarchically again and I think this is why I respect the Catholic Church, and that they won't let me have communion. Right. It irritates me to death. When I was at Notre Dame, I was like, hand going up, my husband slaps down my hand, like, you can't do that. But that, that's a boundary that matters and that needs to be kept so that we can have healthy relationship. But then I think when we have good boundaries at those core levels, that gives us the strength and peace to be more open at the other levels and able to tolerate an appropriate measure. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, it makes a lot. I mean, I teach at a little Catholic college here, and I know exactly what you mean. I teach undergrad. Just started yesterday, my new term with undergrads. And one of the things that is required is that they have theology classes first year. And it's a very kind of wide open school, but very theology classes first year and philosophy classes to set the tone for the rest. And one of the things they give you free rein with is the capacity to go in there and unfold the richest vision of philosophy you can do. They don't tell me what to teach, but I go in and teach the richest vision I can. And one of the things that you find is most students coming in now to university have not had much philosophical prep at all. None. And so for me, that's beautiful, because it becomes, and one of the things is, I always say, when, make the familiar strange. I want to begin to take all the things you take for granted and start to reveal their contingency, their limitedness, the way in which they aren't givens but gift. And you start to cultivate that, to watch these kids who all different kinds of backgrounds, some belief, some unbelief, some Catholic school, some not, open up to the riches of what we have to offer. Contexts like that are pretty much, that is about as best as you can get in terms of an educational environment to be able to unfold those rich things of faith. I understand that also allows for another professor to undermine all of that, and that becomes a complicated thing in certain university contexts. But on the flip side, the space to do it, and if your things are rich enough, I had a guy, for example, from India, not raised in a Christian home at all, going to this school, took my class in philosophy. Next thing is, he wanted to do independent studies on the notion of being and reality and creation, because it was so blown away by what that was communicating, because he grew up in a very metaphysical world in India, but it was not this kind of world. And he's yet to turn in his paper, because he's still raised. He'll probably get a dissertation out of it. And he started as an undergrad. But these are the kind of strange connections you get. You wouldn't have had in a lot of places, even five or 10 years ago.
That's neat.
Yeah, the door would have been shut on it.
I think the initial sort of engagement is something that's great to think about. How large was the conference, Annie? How many people were in attendance?
I think it was like 300.
Okay, so not huge.
Is the number I saw.
Yeah, so not huge, but not tiny. Not as, that's an environment where you can still feel like you don't have access to the speaker. It's big enough. So it's interesting that they set it up that way. Now, when it comes to, going on to build community, so when we think about the boundaries and what we are looking to do, so, in the early church, there was a very intentional and long-term catechesis that people were put through. We live in a society today with kind of an instant kind of, sort of a fixation on the instant, and that works in evangelicalism as, instantaneous transformation, and we don't have to think about anything after the decision. They're filled with the Spirit, after all, so just let it go, And then what we end up doing is more or less just mimicking in a weird, creepy, kitschy way whatever the society is doing. So we don't actually think about being a people. We don't think about being a community. We just think about being an outlet, like a Costco or something, where people come and get their, Christianity packaged in a way that appeals to the masses who haven't been formed, as Tom likes to talk about, at all. The assumptions are all secular, and we just play to them. We don't actually ever challenge anybody to even question those secular assumptions.
Yeah, now, by the way, this is sort of a tangent, but I heard a report on, I hate to admit it, NPR, that was done with Religion News Service about a new trend in secular music, that's secular praise music. It's more or less, it's inspired by Christian praise music, but it just sort of eliminates, uses some of the same vocabulary and stuff, but it just sort of eliminates any Christian or theistic references. Of course, I've heard some Christian praise music that did that too.
But this is like, I don't even know what the word now is. But where do you go after the word irony? Because you have
satire is what comes to my mind.
Praise music modeling itself on the dispositions, oftentimes, of the secular, and now all of a sudden the secular one.
Well, I remember years ago people would criticize Christian films because basically, they were too didactic and there was no art. And then the secular world did the same thing. The last 30 years or so has just been, secular didactic wokeism. Is this what we're having shoved down our throats?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of weird. Maybe in a strange sort of way, we've actually evangelized or de-evangelized in the name of evangelism. I don't know what to call it.
I'd say one thing about the Midwestuary conference related to that is the culture the culture of that little corner is highly intolerant to that kind of to propaganda, to kitsch, to manipulate. They're just done with that. Just done, and only interested in. The word authentic, as one of the speakers says, is semiotically evacuated. But and some of this relates to, Chris, what you were saying about this, we've adopted our modern capitalistic desire for instant change through the correct product, right? You just find the right product or the right technique and you get quick change. And that's just not how people work. No. Sanctification is messy and it takes time, and people's minds and imagination and even their bodies have to be changed before certain things make sense to them. Yeah. And we need, the church has to have, and this balance is hard, a deep, gracious patience for people and their process without losing sight of truth and the boundaries and the direction we're going. To hold those in tension, right? Here's the truth. Here's where we're going. And I know it's going to take you a long time to get there. To be able to hold those both together, I think, is what is desperately needed. And I think I think Jonathan Pujo does really, really well. As I've gotten to know him and listened to him speak, he's willing to, with the courage, with Jordan Peterson-like courage, say, this is this, water is wet, women are women, and yet have a gracious patience for the fact that it takes a long time for people to get there.
Yeah. Right. Well, that patience part, I mean, again, we're so fashioned and formed, as Chris was saying, by the senses of immediacy and now and technology and the way it makes our expectations for transformation and change almost delusionally having to happen on a time scale that is just unrealistic. But the flip side, what you learn from classic Christian vision, especially the early church, as Chris mentioned earlier, is the long process of catechism and discipleship. Oftentimes, catechism between conversion and baptism, right, was a very long, just elongated process. And this is one of the things, is that we don't know how to do certain things that earlier Christians learned how to do in their discipleship. One is, once you're being fashioned and formed to orient yourself to God the right way and to each other's in that light, that there are ways of through the contemplative and the enactment of obedience, there are ways to begin to see reality that were not accessible in any other way. And we've lost that completely. We've lost the fact that discipleship and seeing are related. And so because of that, we think we can just see the way an enlightenment person thinks if we can just apply a technique or a kind of, all the differing kinds of ways in which knowledge accessibility are offered to us in our contemporary situation. We have not stood back enough to be able to discern what's going on there. And those predispose us to all the kinds of things that ready us for the kinds of technologies that are going to transform us and the world that are inconsistent with creation and redemption. And so we aren't fashioned and formed. We're too impatient to deal with the long process of being weaned from idols and having our loves purified. And because of that, we have no wisdom and no ability to see. And we're scared and we're running and we're trying to figure it out. And we're running to all these people who are starting to say, wait a minute, I'm starting to see it. I don't know how to deal with this. And that's why I think that, the wisdom of our forefathers in the faith, the way in which they would talk, Chris talks about it a lot, Glenn too, the way in which family, right at the heart of it. And what is family but your immersion in the first part of the created order that gives you the sign system from which to read reality? What else is it? It's a sign system of relationships and modes of meaning that sets the table for everything else assumed through all Scripture, but everything in your life. if you're removed from that, which technology and the Enlightenment tend to do, then all of a sudden your sign system is out of base and you are lost. And so,
and we could think about examples, particularly say in the former, Iron Curtain countries like Romania, where we had kids who were raised in orphanages in such a way that they basically became sociopaths. I mean, the kids just didn't know how to relate to other people because they were raised in this kind of industrial manner, depersonalized, without the relationships to fathers and mothers that, make us, not sociopaths. and if the transhumanists have their way, what we saw in Romania will be the norm. It's just kind of super creepy.
They're actually working very hard right now on developing artificial wombs in China.
All right, that's the next show. Don't start that right now. Okay? I just spent 2 to 3 days preparing for that.
Preview of coming attractions. Tom. Sorry about that.
Well, Tom, you bring up 2 themes that sort of emerged in the Midwestuary conversations. Mm-hmm. One is, as we try to think how to, respond to the meaning crisis and reintegrate our lives in meaningful ways. One of the speakers, Elizabeth Oldfield, shared that she and her family in London have created an intentional living community. Mm-hmm. And she kind of shared about, the importance of, she's leaning into the, embracing diversity as an essential way for us to build relationship together again. And you can, kind of imagine sort of the culture of London. And so, she shared that her and her husband and her 2 children live with several other adults. They share a bank account. They make home decisions democratically by vote. And she's, she was kind of, and I was alarmed by kind of the positive, winsome way in which this model was discussed, because I think what you're saying is Christ has ordered reality in a certain way. Yeah. He has ordered creation in a certain way to reveal truths to us about himself and his, in his family, the divine family. And like, I love what you're saying of, the sign, our experience of the family is the place where we begin to be tutored in those sacramental structures of the world, and messing with those structures is really not a good idea. Yes, we need to find ways to support families better and maybe better integrate generational families again, but just abandoning that God-given created order, I think, is a bad idea. So that was one topic that came up.
Well, and with a lot of times you see, because of the certain language in the New Testament about redemptive and the doing away and the new created order, you see people run with these kind of new diversity types of redefining social community, even down to the family. And this is the whole point of Oliver Donovan's work of creation and moral order, resurrection and moral order. It's not an undoing of, it's a reaffirmation and then a fulfillment of. And that if you're going to make sense of those other passages that deal with kind of neither male nor female or all these things, they're not read Gnostically or anti-creationally. They're talking about different kinds of transcendent relationships in which those things are not the definitive meaning center, but nevertheless, those aren't done away with. They set the table for that to be made sense of. And so for them, they blur that, and then therefore you start to get this almost Gnostic redefining of the created world, in which the fabric of family and male, female, and the reproductive, and all of the rest of the things that are God-given gifts, which are filled with meaning signs and therefore reference points to the connection to the Creator and creation, are done away. And then what do you have? Well, you have what technology keeps doing:
and on top of that, Tom, it's not like we haven't tried this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, over and over.
I grew up in that world. That world is just Looney Tunes, and so like when I hear about a person like this woman, I can't help but wonder, where is she coming from? What is her experiences? How young is she? Whether or not she's had maybe a childhood maybe where it was fairly stable, and maybe she took a lot of things for granted and is open to all kinds of craziness that maybe people like me could help her avoid. Anyway,
we've already been down.
I don't know her at all, so I don't mean to be too dismissive. But anyway,
we just didn't try communism hard enough. You guys know that.
That's right. That's right. Getting back to this, for example, technology. The irony that here we have some really valuable connections occurring in a fragmented world, and the fragmentation in part is due to technology, but now this is the very means by which some people are connecting with each other. I know in my own life that's certainly true.
Oh.
At the same time, we've got sort of technology going even further to break things down and turn the world into Play-Doh, and at least give us a sense that it can be molded into anything we want to fashion it into. And then there's the question of, for example, as someone who's operating within the framework of the Reformed faith, providence. So when you receive certain things in terms of like this is a new thing, the impulse for a lot of people in the tradition I'm a part of is to try to find the good in it and try to put it to work, but maybe there's a little naivete when it comes to that. So I'm working my way through Paul King's latest book. I've got The Ark. What is it? The Machine. Basically, is
unmaking of something.
Making. Yeah, basically, it's really it's well done. I mean, he's a good writer, but at least to this point, there's nothing redeemable about the machine.
Yeah.
The machine just is just something we need to get past, and we need to recover the world that Jonathan Pajot is providing us or explaining to us. Now, my sympathies are, I'm certainly sympathetic to Paul and I'm sympathetic to Jonathan. At the same time, as a Reformed guy, I'm like, well, let's get real. I mean, we're all kind of meeting each other on this tech.
Yeah.
What do we do with that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's what love him or hate him, John Bilbank used to say, you can have an alternative modernity. You can have an alternative technology, one infused. It isn't an either or.
Yeah, I've got mixed feelings about him too.
Yeah, well, that's right. But I think he's onto something with this. You don't have to always settle for an either or. The comprehensiveness of Christ is that it encompasses all of this. And so it becomes a way, what does technology and conformity to a Christian vision entail? And that's really where our boundaries, both based on the created boundaries, which aren't always easy to discern. This is why I mean, without immersion, for example, in family, and then, of course, the church, it becomes a very difficult thing to be able to discern. And so some people some outliers get a hold of things by grace. They contribute to the conversation, but it is a very difficult thing. But it's something we have to do. We have to say this is where beauty takes us, and goodness and truth. This is a place where ugliness gets in, and something that is anti-creational and undermining the created goodness of things. We have to be able to say that and where it is. Now, whether everyone runs with it or not isn't our concern. We can't. That's where sovereignty comes in. That's where providence comes in. But that's our responsibility. That's what proper dominion is. And at this time, you could almost see it's not so much just even stewardship. At this time, we could say contra Bacon, Francis Bacon, that this is something where we're called physicians of nature. We are to have this way of bringing about a kind of healing, but requires the contemplative, the recognizing what things are, where the boundaries are, and then unfolding things within the parameters set by the potentiality that are for something good, rather than for something that work against it and then to the harm of the rest of creation. That is not easy. That requires uprooting. It is not something you can apply a technique or a technology to get a hold of.
I keep thinking back to the father of cultural apologetics, C.S. Lewis, in the epilogue to, I don't believe I'm blanking out on the
Discarded
name.
Image?
Discarded Image. Thank you very much. I have no idea how I could have possibly lost that. But in the epilogue, he talks about, all right, modernity has happened, and we can't make believe it didn't.
Yeah.
But we don't have to be stuck there.
Yeah.
We can go through modernity and recover elements of the medieval vision that he describes that situate us in a meaningful way in the universe. Tell us who we are. Tell us what we're here for. All of these kinds of things that are really discarded with modernity. We can recover those. We can't make believe modernity doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So we go through modernity. We use the things that are there, the insights that are there, but we synthesize it with this other vision of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a key to that is learning to think hierarchically again, right? We can't think democratically or monistically, everything's flat, univocally, let's say.
Yeah.
Neither can we think dualistically. It's too simple. We have to think hierarchically. And as you were saying, Tom, then also teleologically again. I mean, those are the two core principles that we have to use to re-put this cathedral back together in a way that does acknowledge the lessons of modernity. I think in a lot of ways, phenomenology is a really important development. That's a whole nother topic, but thinking hierarchically and teleologically. So we think according to the nature of things as discerned by their purposes. Okay. And then that's the key to figuring out how technology and AI fits in a proper hierarchy, right? It does not, so this is I kept thinking, Chris, you would have loved the conversations that John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau, if they come up on video, had about AI, because they really went at it, hashing out the nature of what AI is, where it belongs in a proper hierarchy, and whether or not we have a moral relationship to it. I mean, fascinating stuff. I could probably talk for another hour about that. And surprising, Pageau was the one, John Vervaeke argued you should not use LLMs at all. Ruffled some feathers with that. Pageau was like, it has a place in its hierarchy. It's just down here. And I think Vervaeke was like, most people are too stupid to keep it there. So just don't use it at all, right? So that was a major debate.
And there is some legitimacy to that. It's the old thing, the future is worse than we think it will be. I mean, that was, what was his name?
Well, part
Andrew
of it too, so like
Jones'
some people shouldn't ever use alcohol. I mean, and other people can. There really are people out there who should just never mess with AI. But
both points are there. The alternative modernity will have to be a way to integrate the goods of it and where we are, and these things aren't going away.
Well, I think I agree with you completely. I think one of the things we're going to have to figure out, and that is how to reintroduce teleology to the sciences. Because that's the huge, because they're the ones that are driving a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's what my master's thesis was on. That this Haldane's famous quote that for the biologist, teleology is a mistress. He doesn't want to show her in public, but he can't live without her, right? And that's
a good way to put it. I never thought about it.
Even Darwin.
And it's true because, and this is something Vervaeke is very good at as well, is that human purposes guide everything we do. That science itself is nested within the purposes and intentionality of the scientists who are constructing the experiments, who find certain goods and values in what that they're investigating. And so we've pretended that we had this dualism between, the subject and the object, and you could have an objective observer. And Vervaeke's very good at technically explaining why that is dead, why modern epistemology is just dead, and that actually human intentionality, human purpose is actually the way through which we understand the world, even within the sciences. So there is interesting work being done there, but unfortunately, it doesn't get any traction.
Michael Hamby's been doing it for years too. We've had him on here about that, to Michael Hamby on that topic. And I'm surprised more people aren't it's not easy stuff to read. So.
Well, but I think that the perhaps the reason has to do with the fact that the reintroduction of teleology is limiting, and we don't like that limiting reality. It's one of the things that I guess drives a lot of tech development is the quest to transcend limits.
But see, that's right. Yes. The open arena to where teleology makes the most sense. I mean, because
But the thing is but we're dealing with with unredeemed people. I mean, we're dealing with people who really do. You just read some people like Brian Johnson or Kurzweil. I mean, they really do.
Yeah.
Believe in the sort of the divinization project. I mean, that's really
their teleology. Yeah.
But and that's fine. They'll say, and that's what I'm bringing to this. In other words, they're not talking about discovering the ends in things.
Yeah.
They're talking about what I want to do
the end. Yeah, they're the embodiment of the end, the projection of the end, the volition. There's your voluntarism, right? The imposition of an end onto reality, and therefore the directing of all things to it. Yeah,
exactly.
Right. Which brings up something I'd like to get your thoughts on, Annie, because as I've thought about Tolkien's elves. One of the things that intrigues me about them is their tech. In other words, they are the most technologically advanced people in Middle Earth. In other words, apart from obviously the Valar and stuff, but everybody assumes that what they're up to is magic. You get that little interaction between Galadriel and Sam. He wants to see elf magic, and she's like, what are you talking about? But there's something about the elven approach that I think is Tolkien's argument. He's proposing an alternative tech.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever given any thought to that, but it's definitely a contrast to, say, Sauron's tech.
Yes. So at the end of Abolition of Man, we'll return to our man Lewis here. At the end of the Abolition of Man, he says, there's nothing I can do that will prevent people from saying I'm anti-science and, I hate, anesthetics and whatever. But what I'm asking for, he's like, I hardly know what I'm asking for is a regenerate science, right? And so I think that's what Tolkien is exploring imaginatively, a regenerate science. And what Lewis really, at the end of Abolition of Man, gestures towards is a science that wouldn't forget what a thing is. Yeah. They wouldn't reduce it to Plato in its analysis, but that as we understand it, and as we would remember its purpose, we would remember its essence, we would remember its nature, and all our effort to understand or develop the latent potentialities within the thing would stay in harmony with its created order. And I think that's what the elves are doing, right? That their knowledge and their technology and their arts are staying within the harmony of the woods and the water and the world, and they're not breaking those purposes and those nature in essence merely to have power, which is what most modern technology and Sauron's technology clearly does.
And that's what Bacon broke down, because before the contemplative was a presupposition before the active element of transforming things, and he was to melt those into each other, and to say basically in the unmaking, and then the remaking, and so therefore you're tearing at something that you're learning about as you tear it down, rather than discerning its teleology and purpose. We're not talking a time scale. It's not, I sit around and contemplate something. We're talking about ontological perception, which we have become deadened to. And this is a part of what retrieval is all about, getting a hold of the capacity to see again. And that's really where all these things end up at the end of the day. Is if we can't have the capacity to see again, we're going to run right over things we're missing.
But even people who read Lord of the Rings with appreciation can really take some weird things from it. So I remember coming across a Russian guy who was an apologist for Sauron on this very point. the idea that, Saran was trying to liberate us from our bondage to nature. Anyway.
And Satan's the hero of Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
There's nothing new under the sun.
Right. Well, this has been a great conversation, a lot of fun. Anything that you want to leave us with, Annie, as we kind of wrap things up?
I think one thing I do want to say, and I think made the strongest impression on me at Midwestuary, to return back to that topic, is the sheer joy I saw everywhere at these people getting to meet one another in person, right? All these conversations online and banter online and videos and talk online is wonderful and really helpful to so many of us as we try and make sense of our world and try to figure out how to live well in it. But nothing surpasses, right? Incarnation, shaking hands, seeing one another in 3D. And I just loved seeing people's joy in each other, right? And a joy that I knew was rooted in the conference was called the Fellowship of the Spirit, was rooted in the way that people are tapping back into, right, the Lord of creation and seeking him. So that was a really meaningful part for me. It gave me a lot of joy. It was really joyful to get to participate in that. So, to all my friends I met at Midwestuary, it was such a joy to be with you. A little foretaste of the eschaton, right? Where finally heaven and earth are fully wed back together and we are whole together again.
Well, that's great. Anyway, we should probably wrap it up with that. That's a good way to put a period or an exclamation point on. Anyway, that's right. Thanks a lot for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. We really appreciate your support and your interest in the work of the show. And if you'd like to help us out, that would be appreciated. We have a Patreon account. And if you want to become one of our patrons and help us pay the bills, we would be grateful. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.